Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a phrase that could describe the dialogue in the Commons over the past few weeks. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. Can't really complain. Lots of podcast editing on my plate right now, but I've been playing around with some things. As you know, there's our bonus episode that's going to be going up probably the week after this with Mishmash Mayhem, so that should be fun. That was a lot of fun to record. I just have been a bit behind on the editing, so that'll go up soon. But this obviously has to go up first because this is time critical. And speaking of time critical, I'm afraid no Patreon headlines this week because there's too much news. Isn't that right, Rob?
There's far too much news, yeah. So I wanted to give a brief reason why. So in this week's episode, we're going to cover party conference season, which would usually be like a mega episode in itself because you've got to cover the views of all the main political parties. But as well as that, we've had the Supreme Court verdict, and we've had I wanted to touch on the subject of unparliamentary language within the Commons. So the way that the rhetoric has really turned incredibly fiery in the House of Commons in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime. So there's a lot to cover this week. I just thought maybe for the Patreons, we could cover one quick little story from the other side of the pond that I'm sure hasn't escaped your notice.
Oh, yes. No. I mean, this is where if we were John Oliver, we'd be whacking a big red button on the desk and it would say, "We've got him," in massive letters. And then it would be kind of a damn squib because it's not that quick. So yeah, this is the fact that they have actually finally started impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump. And this is something the Democrats were kind of umming and ahhing about for a bit, as I think a lot of people expected it to happen based on the Mueller report. But then the Mueller report kind of was like, well, we know he was a bit dubious, but really we can't convict him based on this, was the kind of summary, which, didn't really help anyone because people were expecting it to be this kind of golden bullet, but it was very much instead of being a golden bullet, it was very much a kind of like, well, yeah, I mean, he's probably done something dubious. He is Donald Trump. Are you shocked? And they got Mueller to come and testify this multiple times. But essentially, everyone was kind of building up their hopes that the Mueller report would be this way of kind of getting him, and that's not happened. But then Trump managed to walk into yet another controversy, which has been deemed enough to start impeachment proceedings. Do you want to fill us in on that?
Yeah, so really quickly, it comes from a whistleblower's account of a phone call Donald Trump had with the Ukrainian foreign minister. The whistleblower is said to be sort of like a member of Trump's internal staff or somebody who's in like a neutral political position. If they're from within Trump's inner circle, they've got to be somebody fairly neutral to be privy to this conversation. And apparently after hearing it, they launched an internal complaint, something that had formerly been redacted when they were looking at the sort of during the Mueller report, and this has now come to light, and the Democrats now think that this is enough to try and push for impeachment for Trump. So essentially, the conversation that Trump had with Ukraine, he said, "I'm going to withhold some funds from you. We're not going to give you the arms that you're requesting," because Ukraine at the time wanted to buy some Javelin missiles, which are anti-tank missiles, from the United States. Trump says, "Yeah, I could do that, but maybe you could do something for me in return."
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more.
Exactly. And this thing was investigate Joe Biden's son. Why would Ukrainians know anything about Joe Biden's son? Well, he was on the board of a Ukrainian-owned energy company that had been accused of some dodgy dealings, some sort of like corruption within Ukraine. They'd been thrown out of some certain government deals. And Donald Trump may have been hoping that he could get some dirt on what could be a potential presidential candidate in the near future, coming up in the 2020 election.
Of all the things that this smells of, it's not the same, but it is in the same kind of realm of things as Watergate, right? Trying to find out stuff about a political enemy, using your power in office to do that, essentially.
Yeah, precisely. And it's all about his power in office. So as president, Donald Trump has certain advantages over that of an internal candidate. He has access to people that somebody like Biden wouldn't do just because of his position. And if you use that power, if you're able to, as the Democrats have alleged, stop the sales of, stop helping an ally in their fight against Russia until they give you some dirt on your political opponent, that is illegal. And there is particular constitutional statutes that says, yeah, you can't do that as president. So I think this is why the Democrats have been like, they've gone for this as their impeachment chance.
It definitely seems like the strongest thing they've had against him. And it, as I say, like, it's alluding back to Watergate, that you can see that kind of thing has brought down a president before. So it seems like out of all the options they've had, it's definitely the best one so far, but not we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, definitely. Trump's defense on this is a bit shaky, and it sort of comes into another legal question. So Trump says, yeah, I did say that we were restricting funds for the Ukrainians, and I said that I would like some dirt on Joe Biden, but these two things aren't necessarily linked. Is his argument. He says, I know what I did was immoral, but the two weren't linked, and even if they didn't give me that information, I would have helped them out on the end with this arms sale. Which is, it's kind of a weak defense, but it's trying to move the goalposts from something that is illegal to something that is immoral. And like you've said about the Mueller report, that's what Trump was able to do. Mueller said that I found nothing in this report that suggests that Trump has done anything illegal, but he certainly has done some morally questionable things during his time as president, which I think is clear for most of us to see, that he's taken the role of president in a very different manner that his predecessors have. So that's the story from why the Democrats have gone for it. In a question of how successful it is, you've really got to, we've got to watch the news and see how the public react. It's worth thinking that when you go back to Nixon and his time in power, he was impeached over Watergate, and public opinion was really closely divided about that for quite some time, until you had the release of the tapes, until it looked like there was a clear legal case against Nixon. And that was what led to Nixon resigning in the end before he could be impeached, because essentially a lot of the Republicans within that Senate turned against him, and he saw his chances of withstanding impeachment as impossible.
Completely hypothetical here, but do you think Trump would have the the wherewithal to step down in a similar situation?
I don't think Trump is a quitter. I think Trump is a man who fights it all the way. And even if he was impeached, I think he would try and fight it and appeal and do everything. That seems to be a common trait amongst the Trumpian side of the Republican Party. There was a governor in Alabama, I think, who was defeated narrowly in a Senate election and then refused to accept the result, and then challenged that in the courts and challenged it again while everybody else got on with their lives. So I don't see Trump going quietly into the night. But we are a long way away from that. Impeachment as a process is fairly political more than it is legal. A lot is done more in the court of public opinion than it is on a legal stage. So for impeachment to pass, it has to be a majority within the House. That's likely to happen because the Democrats have a majority in the House.
And the Democrats are anti-Trump, unsurprisingly.
Yeah, precisely. And they haven't been shy about their want to impeach Trump. It's been sort of almost like a de facto campaign slogan, and was said by many prominent Democrats during the midterm elections. The real question comes when it comes to the Senate, which is still controlled by the Republicans, and you need a 2/3 majority in the Senate to get a president impeached. Simply, the maths doesn't work out for the Democrats there. The Democrats really have to hope that, like Nixon, ironclad evidence comes up, public opinion really shifts to the point that Trump's position is indefensible. Then you will see the other House Republicans have to shift to try and save their party's reputation coming up to a 2020 election. If Trump is impeached just before then, it makes, the Republicans suddenly have to start doing primaries.
They suddenly have to pick someone, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, which will be very out of the blue. They might stick with Pence, unlike, when Nixon stood down, Spiro Agnew was caught up in the whole Watergate scandal, and that's what led to Ford becoming president without ever facing an election. But I think Pence has been able to keep his nose fairly clean because the alleged conversation was something that happened between Trump and the Ukrainian foreign minister within the Oval Office. Pence wasn't there, to my knowledge. So
yeah, Trump's very much a fan of this, like picking up the phone and having someone at the other end, which does mean it's less likely that someone might be involved in that because, I mean, they could technically be in the room, but there's a difference between watching something happen and doing it, I suppose, in this situation.
Yeah, exactly. I think it would have been quite an ask for Pence to step in at that time and stop Trump from what he was doing. I mean, he'd already said it as well, which was kind of the bad thing. So yeah, this is just, I thought we had to touch on this story, see how it develops. Personally, I feel the way things are going at the moment, this was a story that had a lot of momentum last week, and that momentum seems to have slowed. A lot of that is down to Donald Trump having some absolute tirades on Twitter against the media, calling it a witch hunt, saying that the whistleblower's partisan. He's trying to, his tactic here is to try and make this not a legal battle, but a partisan battle, a political fight. He's telling people that, the Democrats and the whistleblower is a Democrat and everybody's lying to you. I'm the only president for you. Keep me in. Everybody's trying to get rid of me. No matter in every
Drain
way
the
which
swamp.
possible. Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
He's just going to shout "drain the swamp" until people vote for him, and it'll work.
Yes,
somehow.
A lot of all caps on Twitter right now. But yeah, if Trump is able to wrestle away the narrative, he might be able to dodge another bullet here. If the story keeps rumbling on and more dirt is revealed as the week goes on, we might see a change. But that's it for now.
But as we said with Watergate, it was there for a long time before it finally tipped. So this could just be a bubbling undercurrent all the way up to the election almost, and either it comes to something or it doesn't. But we'll see.
We're about a year out from the election, actually, just over a year until the election. So the election campaign's really going to start hotting up. I imagine Trump will want this off his plate by the time we start getting to debates.
So for our main story tonight, we're going to be discussing conference season. I've put a link in the show notes that you should listen to so that you understand my obscure internet reference I'm going to make. So first up, party conference season. Do you want to explain what that is?
So this is a time that happens about every year. Sometimes you get spring conferences and autumn conferences. This is a time where every party gets to get together with their members, and one, gets some media attention. Two, it helps to generate that sort of buzz around their policies and helps them to direct their policies. So often there's a lot of motions passed at these, which they take votes from members on the party floor to say, right, we the X party stand for Y. So it's a really good way of judging not only public opinion but the mood of the political party at the time. And this year it's more important than ever because, as is widely known, Boris Johnson is pushing for a general election. So it's likely that this is going to be the last party conference before the general election. So anytime that members want to get a new motion onto the floor or want to change the direction of their political party, now is the time to do it, because what you say now is likely to be in your manifesto. So yeah, that's what a party conference is, and that's why it's so important, particularly these ones.
When you've lost the referendum and Brexit's got you down, it's conference season. So it's Lib Dems first.
You're going to have to give me a moment to recover from that. Sorry. Yes, it is the Lib Dems first. Their party conference happened from the 14th to the 17th, and it was important for two main reasons. The first one was it's the first time Joe Swinson has been leader, so it's always a party leader's first test is to see how they perform in their speeches. You may remember from last year, Theresa May's dreadful speech at her party conference, where
the one with all the letters falling down behind her.
Yes, and her coughing and the P45. That is probably the example of like the worst that a party conference speech can go. So you're just trying to avoid that Theresa May moment. I think Jo Swinson was able to, avoid that fairly successfully. She certainly didn't cause any major headaches for the Lib Dem party. I forgot she danced as well. That was the signs were that May was maybe not on top form. Okay, so I've just put an article in the chat, which is the one I'll be using. So there were just 6 sort of like key takeaways from the Lib Dems, the Lib Dem leader's speech. She seemed to be quite comfortable in front of the camera, and I think that's reflected her time in PMQs. She's been in the media before, So having that background helped her to perform quite like a competent speech. Her aim is to try and put the party firmly in the centre ground of British politics. That's what the Lib Dems want to say. They want to say, Conservatives, you're too far to the right. Labour, you're too far to the left. The Lib Dems occupy the sensible, inverted question.
Sensible, in quote marks, yeah.
Yes. Party in the centre. You can take that with a pinch of salt or not. There's a lot of backlash against centrism at the moment. That's why we've seen the two parties go the way they are. But there certainly is a space in British politics or a need for a central party, and the Lib Dems are now more than happy to take up that space. And I don't think Jo Swinson is shy that that's her aim. She's also trying to take votes away from Labour and the Greens, more importantly. So I think if you are a Conservative voter who supports Brexit, you're very unlikely to suddenly switch to the Lib Dems. So where they want to hoover up some support is from those within Labour who want to have a party that's firmly anti-Brexit, and from the Greens who are also anti-Brexit, but arguably less likely to have a bigger impact in the general election. The Greens currently only have one MP, and that's Caroline Lucas, and I would say that they are, with the greatest respect to the Green Party, that they are unlikely to pick up any more seats. So the Lib Dems are looking to, say that we've got a Green New Deal as well. We've got, she promised a green investment bank and to cut carbon emissions, and stealing those sort of voters or trying to woo them away to the Lib Dems is a pretty solid vote winner.
She mentioned Philip Lee, which we touched on last time.
So let me just use her words here. So we cannot be satisfied with a place on the fringes of British politics, narrow and pure, small and irrelevant. Our job is to gather the forces of liberalism and be the rallying point for change. She said, for those in the party who are unhappy about omitting Philip Lee, she said, we must be welcoming and inclusive, recognising the journey fellow travellers are on. The way I read that is...
I mean, it's a very political statement to kind of make it seem less bad, is how I read it.
Yes, precisely. She is trying to play politics there. But the political point all the way to paper over the cracks is like, look, the Lib Dems are a party for lots of different political refugees at the moment. You've seen that from Change UK, which had a mixture of those from Labour and the Conservatives, and the Lib Dems have gained from that split within both the other main political parties, and probably gained equally from it. They've got Christina Berger from Labour and Chuka Umunna that have come over to the Lib Dems, and you've got people like Philip Lee and the other Conservative MP whose name escapes me, but he was one of the ones that lost his position when he voted for the Ben Act. He's now joined the Lib Dems as well. So her saying, we are a broad church, we are accepting of people of lots of different political, walks of life and freedom of speech, is her way of trying saying, please, voters, if you have these centrist views, come to us. But it's also a big risk that it'll alienate those who, on the far, not on the far left and far right, it will alienate those who take some political issues very, very seriously. Philip Lee's anti-LGBT status is very serious and has lost people from the party, by him joining, and it will probably lose a few more. So it's a very fine tightrope to walk that for Jo, and I think that's probably her biggest weakness, I would say. Although she, clearly politically is trying to turn it into her biggest strength. And finally, and this will just touch on a few points of the motions that the Lib Dems passed during the party conference. So we've talked about motions. These are things that members will vote on the House floor. They'll be often come from the members rather than the party itself, but they can be directed by the party. Someone within the party or an MP can say, I'm thinking about putting this motion forward. What do you think, members? And they say, oh yeah, I probably agree with that one. So I got a few examples here. So you can have a list of them, or the Lib Dems are very handy by giving you a list of all the motions that they voted on. There's some that are emergency motions that touch on more like hot button issues. So F32 touched on the Amazon fires. Spoiler alert, the Lib Dems think Amazon fires are bad and they want to stop
Funny
them.
that, yeah.
Yep. There's F33, which was on parliamentary democracy, most notably the prorogation of Parliament, which was happening at the time. Spoiler alert, the Lib Dems think that's bad, but it's an important way of them formalizing this. There's a lot of way that, the leader can say this on behalf of the party, but it has an extra strength when it seems to be supported clearly by the members as well. Probably the most important one that the Lib Dems passed was F17, which was a motion on Europe that was really spelt out the party's Brexit policy and what they will run in the general election. So back in 2017, and Vince Cable's line has always been, we want a second referendum. The Lib Dems believe that the country should be given a second chance to vote on if they want to have a Brexit or, do a Brexit deal. They're probably more pro having a deal rather than no deal Brexit, or remaining within the European Union. The Lib Dems shook this up at this party conference, saying that no, if the Lib Dems get in power, we won't have a referendum. We will just revoke Article 50 and we'll stay in the EU. What's your opinion on that change, Tom? Do you think that is a radical departure, or do you think that's something that the Lib Dems can benefit? Do you think that there's a good reason for that change at this time?
I think realistically it's what they always wanted, but they couldn't necessarily be outright for Brexit just after the vote because of, all the arguments we've seen about whether, it is democracy to go with this narrow vote and all of that. I think there was a period of time where they had to kind of sit there and say, hey, we'd rather it was Remain, but kind of stick with that line of, if Brexit happens, it will be we'll go for a soft Brexit, which is what we saw after the referendum. And then I think there's definitely been a shift, and they're trying to chase those votes of people who are staunchly Remain and would like a chance to stop this now that we've seen it. And also, I think there is also an argument that as we've started to see more and more of what's happening as we get closer to no deal, that there is definitely an argument that some people would change their minds. I've spoken to some people who have changed their minds based on that. So I definitely think trying to targeting that and saying, hey, look, we are the Remain party, because as we know, Labour's official position is not stop Brexit entirely, because they have to walk that fine line. And I think the Lib Dems can position themselves in that way, opposing everyone else essentially to try and pick more votes. So I think that's kind of why it's happened, but I think realistically it's what they always wanted to be campaigning for. So in some ways they've kind of just, the gloves are off. They're like, we're finally going to fight for the thing we've wanted all along.
Yeah, it's freeing in a way, I think, for them to finally say what they wanted to do all the time. And it's probably the most simple message they can have. Vote us into Parliament, we will revoke Article 50 and stop it. That's the easiest way. There's no if, ands, or buts in that. I think they've also got a democratic argument saying that, if we win a general election, then that's democracy in action. They are one of the few anti-Brexit parties, staunchly in that manner. Probably them and the Greens are the only ones, and the SNP, I guess. But certainly within England, they are the third party, the one that will give them a chance to say, no, we are definitely the stop Brexit party. So if we were to win a general election on the back of that, then we would have a mandate to stop Brexit entirely. And I think lastly, it's revoking Article 50 is probably the most practical solution given the time frame that we've got left. If it's October 31st or January 31st, no matter what happens, if a general election was to happen before then, or if a general election happens after October 31st and we still are in the EU, then revoking Article 50 is the best way to stop the ticking clock, stop us having these endless extensions. And maybe then we can think about, maybe once you've revoked Article 50, then you can have another referendum. I know that sounds a bit mad, like you're endlessly playing out this Brexit drama, but stopping the clock is something I think everybody would quite like now, or some people would quite like now, just to stop the constant extensions.
Yeah, and I mean, when Article 50 was invoked, I remember us discussing, I think that was even before we'd started this podcast, which kind of sprung up as a response, I suppose, a chance for us to air our views when we're feeling unheard. But when we was talking about Theresa May triggering Article 50, we're like, that's not enough time. And we've said that since then, and it's proved to be not enough time. So I think there's definitely an argument to be said, and I think that possibility will get lost in all the media around it because it's very Brexit or no Brexit. But I think, there is a possibility to stop Brexit as it's happening and then take stock, go and have a discussion, actually work out what a deal would be, then come back and say, okay, do you accept this deal or or remain or whatever the option is, similar to what Labour's saying, but that I think the clever thing they're doing is kind of positioning it as just remain at the moment, even if they do want to have that open discussion once everything's done, and like that allows some freedom in the people going around and canvassing people to say that. But the message, the overall message, is stop Brexit, which is appealing to that Remainer base.
Yeah, certainly. And I think as we'll have a look at the poll figures later, but these party conferences act as a lightning rod for public opinion on that. That's when they get the most coverage. And it appears, at least in the short term, that the Lib Dems haven't been adversely affected by this motion at conference. If anything, it's slightly strengthened their position. So yeah, it's a gamble for Joe, particularly as a new leader, to take quite a bold step away from the old position the Lib Dems had, but it's a gamble that seems to have paid off.
So I think that's everything in the Lib Dem conference that we wanted to touch on. So you want to hold a conference and nobody's around. It's conference season. I'd forgotten that UKIP even had a party conference. So
did I.
Do you want to fill us in on that?
Yeah, this is like super short and hilarious, and kind of underlines with a bullet that UKIP are no longer a force. But if you cast your mind back to a few years ago, UKIP are one of the main pro-European parties before the 2015 general election. I think Nigel Farage famously said that he was going to park the tanks on the Conservative lawn, basically, and say they were going to take the votes away from the Conservative Party. Now, their own leader decided that he wouldn't show up to their own party conference, citing poor ticket sales as the reason, because they'd sold less than 450 in total, which is unprecedented, and definitely is a sign of a party in crisis. It's a party with quite an internal battle at the moment. The former leader of UKIP party, Mr. Batten, was removed as leader and then thrown out. Essentially, people were unhappy within UKIP that he was moving the party too far to the right. They were making some links with Tommy Robinson and similar figures. So in an attempt to stop that, they banned him from the party and had a new leadership election. However, Batten's mate, Brain, won the leadership election. And because of that internal split, that might be the reason that he also decided to boycott the party, because he feels that those who are attending the party conference aren't necessarily the ones that he wants to attract to UKIP. So, very short, a party in crisis, and this conference confirms to me, like we've said it a few times, that UKIP are dead. But yeah, they are really, really dying now, and it's quite clear to see.
Yeah, as I said, not much to say. But a blip on our news radar, considering what's been going on over the last few weeks. Press F to pay respect.
It's always entertaining when a leader decides not to turn up to his own conference. I can't leave that.
So you think you had the party, but Tom Watson's got you down. It's conference season. So now it's a Labour Party conference. I think the phrase they use on Brexit Cast is scenes. Just such scenes. There was a bit of when the Labour Party conference had started where I legitimately thought, I was like, okay, just hold it together, Labour. The Conservatives are ripping themselves apart, and like day one, they're like, by the way, we're just going to split ourselves in two, is how it felt. And I think they managed to recover from that. But do you want to give us some more detail on the slightly iffy start to their conference?
Yeah, so Labour's party conference started in a bizarre fashion, with news breaking on the Friday, I believe the night before conference started, that a move within the NEC, which is the National Executive Committee, which is quite a small group of people that controls the agenda for what's going to happen at the party conference. They said they were going to put forward a last-minute motion to try and remove Tom Watson from his post as deputy leader. Essentially, this motion would be that they would abolish the post of deputy leader altogether, that Tom Watson wouldn't be elected out, but if there's not a post, how can he stand in it? Tom Watson has basically cut quite an isolated figure at the top of the party. There are some that feel his stance on Brexit, which basically he's very anti-Brexit, and he's openly spoken about the desire for Labour to campaign for Remain in any future referendum. A lot of people think that undermines Jeremy Corbyn's view on the matter, which is that Labour should support Brexit, but it should be a Labour-led Brexit rather than a Conservative one. So, you know, once this move was confirmed by the NEC, which is, like I said, a fairly small group, but it's one that Jeremy Corbyn has been able to get more control over the years. He's now been Labour leader for over 4 years and has quite a few allies in that part of the party. Once the motion had been passed by the NEC, that would then make it to the conference floor. A lot of people within the media and within the party itself felt that this motion would pass and Tom Watson would lose his position, because Watson is also quite unpopular amongst the grassroots, particularly Momentum, who again see him as a figure that is maybe too far to the right of the party or is causing an unnecessary tension, between Watson and Jeremy. So, yeah, that was the big split. Well, that was the big, threat of the split. So why did it cause so much fuss? If the NEC agreed on it and the members wanted it, why would it cause a problem? Surely that's what the Labour Party wants, right? The problem is that Watson represents like the balance in the Labour Party between the right and the left. Obviously, Corbyn is in power, but before then you had Tony Blair, who, as we've spoken about before, is quite like ideologically to the right of Jeremy Corbyn. And people who are from that Blairite era are still within the party and still wish to vote Labour. So if you remove one of those figures from the top, somebody who's seen as a balancing figure, then there was a real fear that it would isolate those on the right of the party, and ultimately it could cause a split, which is like literally the worst thing you want before a general election. Before a general election, you want everybody to rally round, support the leader, stay on message.
And Tom Watson has been before this, I would have said he'd been very effective in that role of bridging that gap between the two sides of the party. He seems very measured. He's been good in interviews. I mean, he's not 100% on message all the time, but I think overall you would say he's been very good as a deputy leader.
Yeah, his role was almost to speak to those on the other side of the party and say, look, I know things aren't heading in the direction that you want to right now, but there are people within the party who are fighting to pull it back slightly on things such as Europe. So he says, look, members, if you think that we're going to do Brexit, if we're supporting Brexit too much, don't worry. There are a lot of people in the party who are trying to make it more Remain, like myself. We've talked about anti-Semitism within the Labour Party and the complaints there, whereas Jeremy Corbyn's approach to it was to support the Labour disciplinary procedure, because that's his job as leader, is to try and say, no, the Labour disciplinary procedure works and is working. Tom Watson was probably more vocal about it not working, and maybe not working fast enough to deal with complaints of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. And that was reassuring to a lot of people who thought, oh, good, there's somebody here who is trying to get that internal change. So if you cause that big split, then you're asking for chaos. I remember before the 2017 general election, if you want to flip it, there was a lot of internal discussion about if Jeremy could even keep his position. He'd had leadership. He'd just recently survived a leadership election against him. And, there were talks of when Labour were at 22% in the polls and the Conservatives were at 40%, lots of Labour members could have turned their back on the party then. But when Theresa May called that general election, they all rallied round. And I think you might agree that everybody seemed to get behind that manifesto that Corbyn put out. I can't remember much open Labour dissent in the 2017 election. And I think that's one factor that led to them doing so well. The party was able to put its problems to one side, say, right, okay, we might not all agree with this manifesto, but it's certainly one of the most ambitious we've put forward. Let's go for it. And it gave them a great result. So why would you try and throw out half your party at this stage? It doesn't make sense. So ultimately, it caused a lot of damage. Corbyn realised the damage it could cause and pulled the motion before it could even get to the floor. It appears that the outrage and the texting between Labour MPs and other people within the top echelons of the party was enough to make them, withdraw that move, or for Corbyn to ask them to not have a vote on it. But the damage PR-wise was sort of done. And I feel it led the Labour Party getting off to a bad start. You mentioned yourself, like you said, right, now's the time for Labour to pull together. And
yeah, I mean, that's exactly what you expect they'd be doing. This is time to beat the drums, get their battle cry for a possible general election, and they spent the first day squabbling as an out, sat here watching it on the news. That's how it seems. If you're not like in the party, it may feel different if you're a member, perhaps, but like watching it as someone who's not there, it just seems silly that that's what they're choosing to do right now.
yeah, the optics were bad, to use a political phrase. The optics were really, really bad.
So that aside, and I think we'll touch on later why that's kind of almost been forgotten in the crazy amount of news we've had. But what were their kind of motions they were putting forwards? Because, as we said, they're not just going all out on Remain like the Lib Dems. So what kind of motions did they put forward? Was it anything particularly interesting, or was it just kind of very similar policies to what they presented at the last general election?
So I think there were quite a lot of radical proposals, even more radical ones at the 2017 election, that certainly caught public attention. So number one was a Green New Deal, essentially a promise to invest in green energy and have this fund, much like the New Deal in America. I don't know if you learned that period of history about FDR and the New Deal.
I'm aware of it, but I never studied it in depth.
Yeah. So the New Deal was, during the Great Depression, everybody's lost their jobs. FDR's way of solving this was the government is going to pay for lots of infrastructure projects like the Hoover Dam, like roads, schools, hospitals, that kind of stuff. If we build stuff that benefits the public, not only are we making the public's lives better by investing all this money, but we'll also create a load of jobs by doing it. This is Labour's sort of intention with the Green New Deal. Will not only improve public health and the environment, it will also make a lot of new jobs for people. So I think that could be a vote winner, particularly if Labour, again, they see a threat from the Green Party. They want to try and attract those votes for them in a general election. Like I've said, the Green Party will struggle. So everybody's looking up to hoover up those votes that could make all the difference in those key marginal seats. They also announced a healthcare service, which was meant to be an idea that is a service that goes alongside the National Health Service, but focuses on social care. There's been, a perceived care crisis in Britain at the moment, particularly with care of the elderly and long-term ongoing care outside of hospitals that we've failed to address, in my opinion, over the past few years. With an aging population, you're always going to your healthcare needs shift. The NHS has been around for over 70 years, and it's still, it's performing its function very well in one way of the immediate healthcare, but those longer term aims, Labour see that there is room for improvement. So again, that's a good possible vote winner, and also actually targets elderly voters, something that Conservatives will be looking to attract as their main voters. So I feel that that's a good policy for a general election moving forward.
Yeah, because in general, I mean, if you look at the demographics, elderly voters tend to vote Conservative overall. So yeah, trying to take away votes there by offering something to the elderly is a good plan.
I just wanted to say it was a policy that Theresa May also famously messed up during her general election in 2017. So it might be that people have that memory of, the Conservatives were bad when it came to social care. If I can trust Labour on that matter, then that might, help me, change my vote and vote Labour this time around.
There were a few other motions that came out of that. One that's already received quite a big response is the one to abolish private schools. So I think they've already come down quite a bit from what they said at the conference, didn't they? Because they were saying we're going to abolish private schools, we're going to seize all their assets and all this kind of stuff to improve the general school system. But I think they've already climbed down on a few of those points.
Yeah, they've toned down on them. Certainly, I think the premise still remains. Labour's ultimate view is that private schooling helps to create an unfair advantage within the education system for the haves and have-nots. That if you can afford to have an education and that makes it better than a state school pupils, then that's unfair, and we should balance those things out. It's probably been one of their more controversial claims because it's so far-reaching, and to abolish anything, there's a lot of people thinking, oh goodness, but I pay for my child's school, what's going to happen next year? It's a fairly disruptive policy in the minds of the voters, particularly those that have, that are already paying private school fees. and it would be quite a challenge for Labour to abolish them entirely. But it's certainly a headline-grabbing action, and one that won't be unpopular within the grassroots of the Labour Party. So I can certainly see why it's a motion that they put forward.
And it had, as I say, it had a response directly from the HMC, which is the Headmasters Conference, or well, Headmasters and Headmistresses Conference, but they decided only to keep one H, which is the conference that's going on at the moment of all of the independent schools. So it just kind of happens to have lined up to make it into more of a news story than it might otherwise have been.
Yeah, certainly. I think when you attack private schools, there's a lot of people who, it sounds bad, it's not a big conspiracy theory, but there are people of those who work within the media. You probably get, there's a higher amount of people who work in the media and work like that who have been to private school and almost feel it's an attack on them and their education that this would be abolished. So I feel that just gained a greater traction within newspapers, particularly within the right-wing press, that this was a bad Labour idea and a reason why it was Labour extremism. But I do think amongst the left, it's genuinely going to be quite a popular vote-winning policy, but certainly it's not a fence-sitting policy. This is one that is definitely going to divide opinion.
Yeah. I mean, people who are sending their kids to private school have chosen to do so for whatever reason would probably be like, oh, that doesn't sound great. And then they were also talking about the 4-day working week and a new higher minimum wage.
Yeah, I think the 4-day working week is quite a bold claim to put forward, and certainly one that shows them as a party for the workers, maybe not as one for business. There's seen a crisis of efficiency within British work at the moment, that people are working too long hours to produce too little. Labour feel that one way of getting of solving this would be a 32-hour week. There are 4-day working weeks in other countries in the world, and that seems to work quite well. And if you were able to balance this out with a higher rise in the minimum wage, then you wouldn't be reducing salaries for people. You might be able to introduce more people into the workplace. In a world where mental health is a problem and the high problems of stress and such, maybe reducing the number of hours people work or the number of days people work would have an overall positive effect on the general population. However, if you're looking at it from a more right-wing point of view, some people associate 4-day or 3-day working weeks with the bad old days of the 70s, the strikes. And I think that was one of the big attacks in the right-wing tabloids was Jeremy Corbyn wants to send us back to the 70s by by bringing in a 4-day working week, sort of skirting over the positives of that point and why you'd want to pursue one. So again, that's a headline grabber and one of the more radical policies, just because you work Monday to Friday. That's what people have just sort of taken for granted for years. It's an unspoken rule that that's what you do. So changing that is going to have quite a big impact and make some people have quite a knee-jerk reaction saying, oh no, that's wrong. Why would you change something that's worked for so long? But yeah, I think Labour's argument is that it's not working and doesn't reflect the way that modern people want to work or the new flexible economy that's beginning to emerge. Lots of big ideas, certainly no fence sitting from Labour. These are all things that when a general election happens, you'll see hopefully discussed in more depth. There's certainly ones where there'll be great differences of opinion.
So finally, we come around to everyone's favourite talking point of Brexit. So much like there was the Stop Brexit motion at the Lib Dem Conference, Labour also had a Brexit motion on the table. What was that and how did that vote go?
So this was a vote put forward by the members themselves, and this was one that actually went against Jeremy Corbyn's sort of core his core message on Brexit that he's been saying. So the motion went that Labour, if they win the general election, should have a second referendum, and in that second referendum, they should campaign for Remain. Jeremy Corbyn's position is that Labour should win a general election, stop a Conservative Brexit, and then negotiate a Labour deal, which would then be passed. They may have a second referendum on that, but Labour would support the New Deal and leaving the European Union rather than staying.
Which, I think has been pointed out by some commentators, would leave them in the interesting position of going and negotiating a deal and then arguing against the deal they have in fact negotiated.
Exactly. So you can see why Jeremy Corbyn was quite keen for this motion to fail because it would have scuppered quite a large part of his message that he's been trying to get across. The vote was close, maybe a little controversially. It was not a card motion. So in card motions, you actually write your answer down on a card and it's passed in and they are counted up. Meanwhile, in other motions, you just stick your hand up. Because usually on the conference floor, it's quite easy to say if one is passed or not. This one was quite close. I believe I read on Twitter from Robert Peston that, there was one person who was reading the room read that the motion had passed, then was told by a colleague that it hadn't. So she said, sorry, I've been told that it hasn't passed. There were chants of, oh, Jeremy Corbyn, as the vote was happening, which certainly shows that those within the conference centre love their leader and want to support him through thick and thin. So Labour avoided that banana skin in the end. The motion was defeated. Corbyn was able to come out with his consistent Brexit message or keep it consistent before the general election. But the closeness of the vote, again, reflects how, we've talked about splits within the Labour Party between maybe left and right at the top, between Corbyn and Watson. It all shows a division within the Labour Party when it comes to Brexit. And you compare that to something like the Lib Dem Conference, where we've said that was sort of like a freeing moment for the Lib Dems, that they were finally wanting to say, yes, we want to stop Brexit by revoking Article 50. That's what we do. This motion still kept Labour walking a Brexit tightrope. If it had passed, like you said, it would be probably even worse for them because they'd have to go into a general election saying that they would like to argue against the deal they've done. And that's really confusing for the voter in a position that no leader wants to be in. So it's probably for the best, but it still leaves their Brexit message a little muddier than the other part.
Yeah, and I think that's a problem we've noted before, is that Labour is trying to have its cake and eat it almost, is how it comes over to people, I think, because they're not so clear on... I mean, now that the Conservatives are fully, we are the Brexit party, when it comes to their stance, which is, due to Bojo and his cronies, and you have Lib Dem saying Remain, so Labour are kind of in the middle somewhere. And even if you think it is a reasonable thing, as you say, it's hard to explain to someone on the street quickly and concisely.
Yes, exactly. But it's a policy that, we're yet to see what impact that will have at a general election. Labour were, played a masterstroke last time by not making the election about Brexit, by turning it more about their social policies. And I feel if Labour were able to turn that towards their social policies at an upcoming general election, that might be enough to cause that surge in the polls to get them across the line and defeat the Conservatives. However, I feel that if it's drawn on Brexit lines, the Labour Party will struggle, particularly when there will be such a strong pull from the Lib Dems for Remain voters.
So the Labour Party conference is coming to a close, and Jeremy Corbyn has to pull his speech a day forward because of some other big news we had this week. What happened there?
Yeah, so right in the middle of all this, we had the judgment in the Supreme Court case that's been going on in London on whether Parliament was legally prorogued or not. There was discussion between the two lawyers in the case. Just a piece of trivia: the lawyer who was arguing for the anti-Boris side was called Lord Pannick.
Oh yes, everyone's favourite. And
you can actually see some photos of him outside the court, or as I describe them, Pannick on the streets of London. So they have this big court battle, and I'll be honest, when I was looking at it, I thought it could go either way. Briefly, the arguments for the anti-Boris side was that, this is an unprecedented way to prorogue Parliament. This is nakedly political, and has not been done in the usual way that you would just to stop it for a Queen's speech. The arguments on the Boris side were that, yeah, this is political, but people have politically prorogued Parliament before. John Major prorogued Parliament just before a general election, so he didn't have to have a nasty vote on Europe, I believe, in 1992. So was able to prorogue it for quite a period of time before then. And it sort of says that their argument was the Supreme Court shouldn't get involved in political matters. As it was, the Supreme Court made their judgment and voted unanimously in an 11-0 loss that the government had illegally prorogued Parliament. They had given misleading evidence to the Queen, and as a result, Parliament should be reconvened immediately. This was seen as a big win for, I guess, Remain. Even it seems bizarre that everything is nakedly Brexit, anti-Brexit at the moment, but it had been those on the Remain side that had been pushing for this because they felt that Parliament needed more time to talk about any Brexit, Brexit changes, or any deal that Boris gets or could get out of the EU. That would need lots of time to discuss, and by him stopping this, it would prevent Parliament from discussing it fully. Yeah. So, have you got any opinions on the Supreme Court challenge and the verdict before we go on to the response in the House of Commons?
I mean, I suppose I think I agree with it. I mean, I don't think it's a bold statement to say you agree with a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court. Seems fairly clear cut to me. And I mean, that's the point of having a Supreme Court, is to trust that from a legal point of view, they know what they're doing. It was very interesting to watch. Made a celebrity out of Lady Hale, who's delivered the verdict and is actually, I think she's stepping down very soon because judges have to retire at a fixed age.
Yes, 75, I believe.
Yeah, so she's 74, so she'll be stepping down fairly soon. But like, for someone a lot of people might not have heard of, I mean, I'd heard of Lord Pannick before because A, it's a memorable name, and B, he's done a lot of this arguing against Brexit stuff recently. But I think most people would struggle to name our Supreme Court justice over here. It's not, becoming a Supreme Court justice over here is not the same, not as politically charged as in the US. And also our Supreme Court's not been around as long. So it's a bit of a different thing to how it's seen in America, where it's very much a political choice, like putting in your favoured judges. So I think most people would have struggled to name anyone in there if they aren't really got their pulse on, what's going on in law. And I mean, the way she gave her verdict, I mean, the verdict itself was pretty, as you say, unanimous and well delivered. But just she was there, she gave it, and everyone was like, suddenly she's a celebrity. She had a spider brooch on.
Spider brooch.
Does whatever a spider brooch does. But yeah, people pointing out that she often picks, a brooch. She has a load of brooches and she picks them to go and stuff. So people think, it's his web of lies and all of this. So I think, I think she's done some very good interviews post that. But yeah, I mean, I think I can't believe, it's one of these things where I think it was quite clear to all of us what was going on. And I think also, before we move on to kind of the response, that, this was very much a thing where they were like, this definitely isn't, we're not proroguing this because of Brexit. No, definitely not. And then almost as soon as this went through, the response is like, we're trying to stop Brexit. Well, you can't argue both sides of that argument, can you? So yeah, let's move on to the response in the House of Commons. So I suppose, so that there's a very good picture of Wilko striding forward to say, we must reconvene Parliament immediately, by which I mean 11 a.m. tomorrow, which, is fair. Like, people had gone elsewhere. A lot of the Tories had gone off to their own conference, so, they do have to, reconvene. But then, yes, the responses in the House of Parliament has led to, as we mentioned earlier, cries of unparliamentary language.
On that Wilko point, I like to imagine him blowing a horn Boromir style, or maybe lighting the fires of Gondor, just to get all the parliamentarians back into the House of Commons. Parliament reconvenes, and it's kind of mayhem. So nobody had been expecting, nobody had put money on this result. Like I said, it was fairly close, but suddenly Parliament is back in, and they're there to do what they're made to do: democratize, bitches. They come back in, and also those who are not on the Conservative side are expecting a couple of things from the government. It's been proven in court that you lied to the Queen. Lying to the Queen, particularly in Great Britain, is seen as one of the one sin you can't do.
I was just going to say, I think there's an important distinction here that we may not have made. So the ruling was that the proroguing of Parliament itself was unlawful, right? But I don't think they went so far as to say officially that Johnson lied to the Queen. That's the heavy implication.
Yes.
But the court itself did not say he definitely lied to the Queen. But essentially everyone reads that as such. So it's just I think there's an important technicality there that had got lost a bit in the news.
Yeah, it's entirely I guess the lie to the Queen line is because Johnson had to ask the Queen and the Privy Council to make a decision on whether they would prorogue Parliament, and the Queen is kind of beholden onto the advice of her ministers, so is always going to say yes. There was a bit of chat before that the Queen might be able to stop it, but nah, she never was. She's always got to say what the executive, in this case Johnson, says. So yeah, you're right to point out that there was nothing officially pointed out by the Supreme Court on that matter. At least you would expect the government to apologise for the decision to prorogue Parliament, that it was considered unlawful. So it's been decided that Parliament should come back, and one of the first people to talk was Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General. So as Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox has been probably more prominent than most Attorney Generals. He's had to speak on behalf of the government a number of times, basically saying that it was under Theresa May's government, I really want to look at what they did. Anyway, sorry, I will skip over that point anyway. But yeah, he'd been forced to apologise under Theresa May for something the government did. He'd then been forced to apologise for the government not releasing the Yellowhammer papers. And then finally, Geoffrey Cox had to apologise that the government had improperly prorogued Parliament. So he kind of says sorry and says that he, respects the decision of the Supreme Court justices, as he should, because
that's kind of the point if you're a lawyer, yeah.
Exactly. However, he then goes on to say that the rest of Parliament has no moral right to be sitting on those fine green benches, and basically calls the party a zombie parliament, repeating the line that, Labour are a bunch of chickens, that, we gave you the chance to have a general election and you refused. That means you're scared of the Conservatives and scared that we're going to win. And by you deciding not to have a general election and letting us stumble on in this chamber, that's morally wrong. You should let the people have their say and remove, and remove this parliament so we can break this deadlock and get Brexit done, which is the Conservative line. This provoked a really fiery response from a Labour MP, Barry Sheerman, basically saying that the government had absolutely zero right to lecture anyone about morals, particularly after they'd just been found to be unlawful themselves. That kind of set the tone for what was going to be the first of many clashes within the House of Commons that day, with the Conservatives essentially provoking the Labour Party and showing, in my view, very little remorse about what happened. A couple of other things that were mentioned by high-profile members was that you had Jacob Rees-Mogg called the decision a constitutional coup, saying he kind of disputed the decision. As we mentioned before, it's kind of bizarre to say that the Supreme Court is going against the Constitution when their literal job is to interpret the Constitution and say what's constitutional. Have I said Constitution enough in that sentence for Jacob? I don't know. So yeah, you've got Jacob almost, pouring a little bit of petrol on an already bubbling Houses of Parliament. Boris then sort of adds further fire to the flames in three ways. So the first, he called the Benn Act, which is the bill that forces us to not leave the European Union on the 31st of October, but instead on January the 31st. He called that the Surrender Bill, which many people saw as quite inflammatory language in itself. It suggests that people who voted for it are, anti-patriotic in a way. It suggests that they're giving up to the EU and creates kind of a very us versus them vibe within the Commons. Two, he refuses to apologise for his actions in the House. He says that he disagrees with the decision, but he agrees with it. He keeps saying, that's the reason we're here. Aren't you happy that we're just here? But he refuses to say sorry, even when questioned on it multiple times by different MPs from different parties. So his lack of remorse is causing quite a lot of anger with those on the Labour benches. Then the one that was really appalling, and I think the one that caused this huge discussion on whether the rhetoric has gone too far, was when a Labour MP, Kim Ledbetter, stood up and said that the language that Johnson was using over terms like the Surrender Bill was the same sort of language that indirectly led to the death of her neighbouring MP, Jo Cox. Jo Cox was killed during the referendum campaign by an ultra-nationalist who had used words like surrender in his writings on his actions and what he did that day. Boris then replied to that quite heartfelt plea by this Labour MP, saying that he'd never heard such humbug in his life, which threw the Commons into absolute fits. You could really hear the disgust and the anguish and the anger coming from the other side of the House. Then at the end, kind of doubling down on it, he said that the best way to respect Joe's memory was to get Brexit done. Again, Jo had been an ardent campaigner for the Remain side. She came to national attention before her death because she'd been one of the Remain MPs who'd been in sort of like the rival anti-Brexit flotilla that had happened on the Thames. I don't know if you remember that. Like,
oh, I mean,
weird farce that happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as bad as the Great Emu War, you know, for like belligerents like Bob Geldof and Nigel Farage. Yeah, I do remember that. That was a particularly weird day in politics, and it's only got weirder since then, hasn't it?
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, that was the sort of thing that brought her to prominence. But with her, you know, with the tragedy of her death and everything that surrounded that, it was making a real point that you've got to temper your language in the House of Commons, and you've got to think about the people outside this chamber. Like, if you keep whipping up hatred like this, then the consequences can be the most severe. Boris would later go on to say that the humbug comment was about the surrender bill rather than Jo Cox herself, but in my mind, the damage has been done. And it's certainly something that, Boris has struggled to recover from. And I think the House of Parliament is trying to work out how you temper that language.
It is like, I mean, that's really not how a politician should be behaving. Like, I think most people, in general, I have been quite impressed, especially like with the Ben bill and all of that. If you think it's this big angry Brexit thing going on, and then you tune into Parliament, and you're actually quite pleasantly surprised. Occasionally, Berko has to get up and shout, "Oh, duh!" But other than that, generally, it's quite good. You know, there's a kind of brr stuff going on in the background, but people are generally making very eloquent points, and they have a chance to stand up and talk, which is what you'd like to see in politics. But some of this, like, I mean, that screenshot in the article you've posted of like an angry Labour MP, I mean, and rightfully so, I would say, based on what's going on. But like, you know, there has to be some kind of level to which, like, we have to hold them to a certain level of account, and obviously that's up to the Speaker, and he does step in. But it's certain things are too incendiary to say inside the House of Commons, I think, because you start using that kind of rhetoric, and it becomes normalised, and that's the problem we saw with Jo Cox. That's, you know, if you normalise the idea that you can attack people because they're, you know, attack MPs, then MPs get attacked, funnily enough, because while the average person would not act on that, it doesn't take many people who like hear that and take it the wrong way for there to be a problem.
Yeah, precisely. And this language has entered our political vernacular like never before, and it's been there before Johnson. So Theresa May, when she called that election in 2017, there was a Mail headline that said, "Crush the saboteurs," which is very evocative language, and not evocative, that's very provocative language, and suggesting that anybody who didn't want Brexit to happen was a saboteur, not somebody who merely disagreed with you. A saboteur has a connotation that you are trying to undermine the country in a way which is like more emotional. That links in with the Surrender Act as well. That has a very similar idea. The Daily Mail has put forward on the Supreme Court ruling, Gina Miller's first one, that basically made it so Theresa May had to get her deal through Parliament. They called those judges enemies of the people, when those judges are ones who are meant to uphold our constitutional law. That's like very that's very provocative language to be, aimed at a very small group of individuals, and for me goes beyond the pale. Boris is the reason Boris is going down this path and continues to do it and probably won't change his language is because, well, I've picked a couple of reasons here, but sort of one, picking a fight within the House of Commons at least is where he feels he performs best. We were talking in the last episode about Boris's public speaking, and particularly his one at that police academy was probably his worst, and at PMQs was his worst when he was trying to be a bit more prime ministerial, even though bits of language stood out from those speeches. He was dithery, unclear, wasn't fired up. Now he certainly is within the Commons, and that appears to be gaining support amongst the benches. Boris Johnson had a huge tirade against Jeremy Corbyn at the end of one of his responses and got a standing ovation in the Commons. I was watching it live, and there was a standing ovation and clapping for something I thought really didn't deserve a clap. It was bizarre, but it certainly fired up passions within some people, and that may have been an indication. I think that probably got more of a clap because the House was so adversarial at that point that the Conservatives just wanted to show support for their man. Two, it stirs up this sort of people versus Parliament feeling that Boris has got. His whole attack line about a zombie Parliament, his attack that you won't give me a general election. He's trying to say that Parliament is against the will of the people. Another phrase that has been used a lot. If you are against the will of the people, then you are seen as an enemy, a saboteur. It's, again, very provocative language that leads you to see the opponents of Brexit as an enemy rather than somebody who merely just sort of disagrees with you slightly on a small area of policy. This feeling is something that he feels can tap in. He feels it's a vote winner, and he feels that he can, win public support by going down this road. Thirdly, he might be finding it a good way to try and provoke Labour into calling a general. I said to somebody at the weekend that Boris Johnson is basically that drunk guy in a pub car park, stumbling around saying, "Come on, if you think you're hard, fight me. And lots of onlookers are just looking bemused from the sidelines, like no, I'm not going to fight you. just stop it. But he won't. He's convinced that this is the way that he gets it done. If he has the fight now, he stands a chance of winning. If he has it after October 31st, I think that diminishes his chances. So that's why Boris is going down that line. That's why Boris is using this language. So unfortunately, I don't think it is going to stop anytime soon. We'll talk about the Conservative Party conference next week, I feel, because it'll give us more time.
I think we haven't had... I mean, A, it's still ongoing, right? And B, we need to take some time to kind of sit on what's happened over the last 2 weeks, I think, and really take it in.
But yeah, and unfortunately, from the speeches I've seen from that already, particularly the ones that happened on Sunday by a group the BBC called the Three Brexit Cheerleaders of Gawke, the Brexit Secretary, Gove, who is obviously in charge of the Brexit planning, and Mogg, who has kept his views on, everybody knows his views on Brexit. The language hasn't changed. They certainly feel that is a vote winner, and the big slogan the Conservatives are going with is "Get Brexit Done." I just wanted to quickly, before we wrap up today, just talk about that phrase, and what's your opinion on it? And do you think it's a vote winner? And do you think it's actually feasible to get Brexit done?
I mean, I suppose that depends on how you define your terms, right? So, can we leave the EU? Yes. We can fall out with no deal. That's definitely a possibility, and that's definitely what they're trying to push for, right? So, can they achieve it? I mean, it's definitely possible, and I think they're basically trying to do their best to tie things up in Parliament such that they can kind of fall out. I know that Boris keeps saying, he's going to make a great deal and all of this, but I don't believe that for a moment, really. We hear all these stories of how, we've been sending people to negotiate, but really they've not really been doing much and so on. So I think I honestly feel like the current government's will is just not behind having a deal before we leave. So will Brexit happen? I mean, I think overall Brexit will still happen. Whether we will fall out on the 31st, as all the adverts on all the podcasts that have adverts inserted based on your location have been telling me, and I'm sure is also on the radio, everything is gearing up for no deal Brexit on the 31st, and I think that's where we're currently headed unless something significantly changes. Yeah, so, I mean, I think they can spin that as they got Brexit done to the kind of people who are already listening to them and voting for them, that's what they want. So if you're already on board with a no deal Brexit, or just let's get this over and done with, let's just have a Brexit, even if you're not for no deal, then I think, if that's what you want, I think they're probably going to end up delivering that, maybe more by luck than by judgment at this point. But I think, I honestly do think that's where we are now, no deal, because as has just been pointed out in the chat, we're a month away from the deadline. How does Boris think he's going to get a different deal? The EU are making noises to, maybe we could change it. But basically, unless we present a proper alternative to the backstop, the Brexiteers aren't going to accept the current deal. And unless we present an alternative to the backstop, then the EU's not going to accept it because they won't screw over Ireland, which we've known for ages. There's a brilliant CGP Grey video on that, which basically shows you this triangle of the problem with the Irish border, which is like, well, you can have 2 out of 3 things, but you want all 3. And if any one of those things goes, there's a serious problem, which I'll bung in the show notes. But yeah, I think, unfortunately, after all this talking about it, we are going to just kind of fall out on the 31st. But it's hard to make predictions at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I think my big issue with the phrase is that it's about as meaningless as the Brexit means Brexit phrase.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And by that I mean that even if you fall out without a deal, Brexit doesn't disappear. All the issues surrounding it, all the issues around a deal, like, you're not going to not do any deals with Europe for the next 10 years. You'll have to go back to Europe and try and negotiate trade deals. You're going to have to do that if you want to help the economy recover. There's no major nation in the world that doesn't have a working trade relationship with their closest neighbours. It doesn't work like that. The discussion around Brexit isn't going to go away. It will happen, but it will continue to rumble on. It doesn't solve the problem. It just extends it. It kicks the can down the road, but in an entirely different way. In fact, maybe the best way to get Brexit done is to get a deal done, rather than falling out with no deal, because no deal causes far more questions and far more problems than a deal would, in my opinion. So I feel it's a very short-minded phrase that is like laser focused on October 31st, and the Conservatives' tactic at the moment, and I think Dominic Cummings' tactic at the moment, is that everything will be fine. The voters will forgive us if we just fall out of the European Union October 31st, come what may. My opinion is like very different. The voters will suddenly find themselves like, oh, we still have to do a lot with Europe, and there's still a lot of questions that are left unanswered, even though we've left without a deal. So yeah, it's maddening and infuriating. And again, it's one of those phrases that I see from the sidelines that just keeps me like shouting from the inside, like, you're not going to get it done. It's like, it's saying like, we should get a Middle East peace process done. Okay.
yeah. It's too big.
Yeah, like it's big, it's massive. Like, of course, everybody wants one done. We all want it done, but there's so much history and politics and other things around it that it means that it's not as simple as getting it done. There's lots of caveats to that decision. So, yeah, I feel people will be disappointed in a number of ways come October 31st if they get Brexit done. Yeah, that's my 2 cents on the issue, and I will shut up and stop.
And so I think with all of that news, I think we should just very quickly give ourselves a quick polls update. So the polls, as we say, the poll tracker that we use is obviously going to be a few days behind all these developments. So we're currently tracking off the 24th of September. So that's 6 days behind where we are now. And I mean, again, it's weird. It's still kind of, some bits are still a bit baffling, I suppose. the Conservatives are sat on 32.9%. They had a bit of a wibble, I think, just around the time the proroguing was going on and losing those votes, but they've just kind of held that base. Labour had a bit of a peak, and now it's trending down again a little bit. Lib Dems have come up since end of August, have come up nearly 2 percentage points. They're now up to 19.7%. Brexit Party is falling down, and I think, as we've discussed before, a lot of those Brexit Party votes are moving across to Conservatives. Greens are kind of falling down, and there's a tiny bump for UKIP, despite the fact they only had 450 people come to their conference. So, yeah, it's just... the polls seem to defy what we're seeing. I find it so weird. I mean, you feel like all these things would have a real effect on the polls, but I think people are very entrenched in their positions now, and there's a bit of manoeuvring going on, but like there's that big pool of Brexit Party votes that can go to the Conservatives and keep them buoyed above Labour at the moment. So it's not looking great for Labour, it could be quite good for the Lib Dems if there was a general election compared to their current number of MPs. But yeah, it's just a bit bleak as someone who's not a Conservative voter.
Yeah, the naked political decision the Conservatives have taken is that we don't think that we will lose traditional Conservative voters to Lib Dem or Labour, and that any that we do lose will be we will gain more from the Brexit Party by going the direction that we're going, and that seems to be keeping them level at the moment. I think if you look at the polls in more detail below, what is interesting at the moment is that you usually have a convergence of polls around one way. Polls tend to adjust so they don't look silly. They don't like being an outlier, or they don't like being the one that's always wrong. So polls tend to converge and say that, oh yeah, in general, the Conservatives are about 5 points ahead, 7 points ahead. We're starting to see a real change in that. I think the difference between some like Opinion, who on the 20th of September put the Conservatives on plus 15, between ComRes, who on the 24th of September put Conservatives and Labour tying on 27% each, shows that we can maybe be a little bit unsure about what the public is thinking at this time and which polling method is correct. So we always say take the polls with a pinch of salt and take the average, and I will still say take the average. That's the best way to manage polls. But yeah, do look out for this trend of not all of them converging around the same point. It will be interesting to see if ComRes is an outlier, or like last time, I think YouGov was the only one in 2017 that predicted a hung parliament, and in the end, they were the only ones that got it spot on, whilst everybody else looked at the polls and thought, the Conservatives have been in such a lead a week before, they can't possibly have a hung parliament from this position. So yeah, keep looking at those polls. In particular, look at the Brexit Party numbers. If the Brexit Party numbers fall, likely to see the Conservatives go up. Essentially, it'll be really interesting to see if the Brexit Party vote keeps up, or if like you always see like a little bounce after party conference season, or traditionally you do. I think the Lib Dems had a conference bounce. I think Labour failed to get that bounce from their party conferences due to the issue that they had. We'll see if the Conservatives' increased media will get them that bounce. I don't know if it will, to be honest, because I think it's pretty clear what the Conservatives want. A lot of people are keeping their eyes on Parliament at the moment, so that increased media coverage won't do very much. But yeah, like you said, a little bleak if you're not a Conservative Party supporter, but I think that there are rays of hope. And as we saw last time, when a general election gets called, things get weird. The conversation changes and polls can change, and the Conservatives are by no means ahead by the same way that they were in 2017. So there's always hope. Yes, I usually end on a dark note, don't I? So this is my hopeful that, maybe things will change for the...
Just one thing I want to throw in that's unrelated to the polls, just back to our first story we talked about this evening. Trump's impeachment there has just been a post by the New York Times saying that it sounds like he was also pressuring the Australian Prime Minister to help with an investigation into Mueller. So I'll just post the link and I'll bung that in the show notes. But yeah, I mean, American politics and British politics are going to be interesting to watch over the next few weeks and months, as they have been since we started this podcast, frankly. So yeah,
too much happening, but yes,
too many things happening. My brain is frazzled, so I think we're going to do the outro. So thank you as always, Rob, for joining me. If you want to support this show and other shows by Tinker Tailor Soldier Sponge Productions, you can go to patreon.com/TTSS. If you want to come and chat with us, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Unparl Podcast. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. And of course, you can go to our website, parliamentary.observer, where you can comment on the individual episodes. And also, there's always a link in the show notes for our Discord server where you can come and listen to us record live and be part of the chat, which is always a lot of fun. Always good to have people pick us up on our failings, things we might get wrong, make us re-record bits. That's fine. Come along and listen to the show. It's always fun to chat with you. And also, just to mention, if you like the show and you want to help it spread, the best thing you can do is tell people about us. Say, I like this podcast. Show them, take their podcast app, put it in for them. That's always good. The most people pick up new podcasts via word of mouth. And it's discoverability in the podcasting space is very much through people telling their mates, oh, I like this, and I think you'd like it too. And so I think it just remains for me to say it's good night from me.
And it's a good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye. Conference season. I thought I'd got through this cold, but, now we're into cold season, so you just have to deal with sultry Wilko.